Hello, today I want to show you one very interesting game which I have played back in 1995. So I think you won't find this game in the database. And here I was facing one of the best grandmasters at the time in my country, Vencesław Inkiov. I was playing with white. So after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, black is playing f5. And for those of you who don't know Inkiov, I think he's one of the best specialists, not only in my country, but in the world, in this line. He was playing all his life this Yanish Gambit, and he has a lot of analysis. And in 95, of course, there was no computers. So probably he had under his belt dozens of games, if not hundreds in this opening. And I think this was my first or second game in this line. Of course, I knew that he plays this, and I didn't want to play the main lines with knight c3 or with d4, because clearly he has much more experience than me. So I have decided to play one not so popular line, bishop takes c6. And now the idea is quite simple. If he takes on c6, white will play knight c3, and then the game is more somehow solid, positional, without too many deviations. Now white wants to play queen e2 next, or castle, and hold the pawn on e4, and black has some weak pawn on e5. Of course, he has good development, so the game is around equal, but at least I wanted to be sure that there is no something dramatic in the opening, which I don't know. And he was trying to complicate the game, so he took with the b pawn instead, which is not the main move, but maybe he wanted to confuse me, because now there is less fury as well. Okay, so clearly now the ideas are a little bit different, because if you play knight c3, maybe at some point black can take on e4, and then there could be some d5 and e4. So I took the pawn on e5. And now, of course, if he takes on e4, there will be queen h5 check. So he went queen e7. And I was not so sure what is going on in this case. But okay, even without preparation, I started to think which is the most logical move here, and this is of course the move d4. Now black here has actually a couple of possibilities, and one of them is a very interesting move, bishop a6, who is not allowing white to castle, and then the game is very complicated. But he went d6, and he played this move relatively quickly, so probably he has played this before. This is my guess. Now, okay, from here I started to calculate now, can I take the pawn on c6? Why he is giving me this pawn? Of course, if I go back to f3, he will take with the pawn, and then I have to move the knight again. The same is if I go to d3. So I started to calculate, okay, if I take, he takes with a check queen e4. I go queen e2, and then we will exchange the queens, and this should be okay for me, so I took the pawn. He takes on e4, I play queen e2. And I was relatively happy from the opening, because now I have extra pawn. The queens will be off the board soon, and then even if somehow he will manage to take the pawn back, the maximum which he can get is some kind of equal game. So now I think black should take, so he took on e2 to destroy my castle. And now he has to play bishop b7, otherwise he's simply a pawn down. And here I started to think now, of course I can play d5, or I can move the knight. If I go d5, I thought the only thing which he can do is to take my knight. So let's say d5, bishop takes, pawn takes, and then knight e7 and knight c6. Eventually he will capture the pawn, and it will be more or less equal game. But then I thought, okay, what if I move the knight? Of course, overall, the light square bishop should be stronger than my knight, but I felt that the position is very concrete, and if I move my knight to a5, he has to take the pawn on g2, but then I can move my rook either to e1, either to g1. Let's say to g1 is the most simplest to calculate, and he don't have too many possibilities to move the bishop on this diagonal, because if he goes to d5, I can attack him with the pawn or with the knight. The same is on e4, and if bishop h3, I can just play rook g3 and f3. So I thought this is a very good move, and now black is actually in trouble because he has to take, and it seems like this is a very innocent position for black, but actually now white has much better development. Here I was thinking between rook e1 and rook g1. Rook e1 is somehow very clever, but because you want to play f3 and then king f2 check, but it's a bit, I think, overcomplicated. So in the end I went for rook g1, and now I think he has to play bishop to e4 or bishop d5. So he chose bishop e4, trying to be a little bit more complicated, and maybe he was hoping that I will lose time to push my c-pawn. Not that this is such a bad thing, but at least this can give him one move to develop some of his pieces. But I felt that there is no need to protect the pawn, because I have to win a lot of tempos by attacking his bishop. So I started to evaluate now, can I play f3? What will happen after f3? He takes the pawn. Then I can go, for example, knight a3, attacking the bishop, and he cannot go to this diagonal, but he can go to a4. And then from a4, unfortunately, there is no way how can I win this bishop. So I thought, okay, maybe f3 is not working. But then I thought, okay, let's try again. f3, bishop takes. Now he wants to go to a4 or to take my knight. And if I go knight c3, he cannot go to a4. And then I want to go king to d2 to grab the bishop. So I couldn't see how can he escape unless he gives the pawn back f4. So I decided to play f3, which I think is the best move. So f3, bishop takes, and now knight to c3. As you can see, f4 seems like the only option here for black, otherwise king d2 is coming, and it will be very funny how the king will trap the bishop in the center of the board, more or less. So he went f4, bishop takes, and here I was super happy from this position, of course, because you can see white has developed almost every piece, and black, he still haven't developed anything, only the bishop on c2, and he will be attacked soon with the rook on c1, and then knight d5 is coming, or knight to b5, so there are so many threats. And here clearly, even if there is an endgame, and there is no queens, but white has actually a very strong initiative, and for black it's very difficult here to find what to do. Probably knight f6 was maybe still the most natural move, at least to develop the knight and to protect the square d5, but then of course white can play rook c1, and when you move the bishop to g6 it could be knight to b5, so he will win the pawn on c7. So it's very difficult actually to see what black can do. And he decided to play rook b8. Practically this is maybe the best chance, because he's protecting the b5, and he's hoping that if I'm too concerned about the b pawn, maybe if I decide to defend the pawn, then already he can play knight f6. And after rook c1, bishop to g6 or f5, now both squares are defended, and black can survive maybe. So I thought, okay, now I don't want to waste time for b3, but clearly he can grab my pawn, so what to do? And I had decided to jump with the knight in advance before he has played knight f6. That's why knight to d5 was played. Now I want to take the pawn. He has moved the king to d7. Now he wants to grab the pawn on b2. And of course now I can play b3, but in this case maybe he can play knight to e7 and he will exchange my knight. So I went rook c1. I was wondering which rook, because you can say that this rook is good on the g file and this rook is not doing anything. But if you are about to sacrifice the b pawn, maybe it is wise to defend the a pawn and to make some space for the king to move to f1 without closing the rook. So I went with this rook to c1. Now there is only one move, rook to b2. He is defending the bishop and he wants to give some checks, of course, bishop e4. But my calculation was that I will move the knight to c4. And now, of course, he can sacrifice the exchange. He can play maybe bishop e4, knight b2, bishop d5. And probably this was worth to try this endgame, because at least he has one pawn and some chances to survive. But he decided to move the rook. So he went rook to b5, attacking the knight. Now, if white takes on c2, of course, black is with the pawn up. But when I played knight c4, my idea was to move the knight to e3, which is defending the knight and attacking the bishop, and now the c7 is hanging. So he has to move the bishop to g6, this is the only thing, and then rook c7. And somehow you can see white has a great coordination. All his pieces are in the center and they are pointing at the black king. And even without queens, it's actually possible to create attack. And it's very funny how in this opening black couldn't develop any of his kingside pieces. Now if he goes to d8, there will be rook c1 and then rook c8 is coming. So he has to go forward to e6. Now he wants to maybe take the knight, so you have to play knight c3. More or less the only move is rook b2 check. And very important move, of course, now king to f1. Like I told you earlier, that's why this rook was played c1 and not the other one, because otherwise now this rook should be on g1. But we want to move this rook to e1. Now finally this is time to develop the knight, but also black has to think how to defend against the possible rook e1 and knight jump somewhere. So he has to leave some square for the king. For example, knight f6 I think is losing immediately, because now there is no place for the king. So he went knight e7. Now we are bringing the rook into the party, and knight d5 is a threat. I think now white is already winning. I don't see exactly what black can do. For example, if he moves the king to f7, there is of course knight d5 and you win a piece. So he went bishop to d3. And then after king to g1. Now he cannot move the knight to g6 because there will be knight d5 check. And then rook f7, for example. I think this should be a checkmate. King f5 and now rook f7 is a checkmate. So he went king f6, at least to get away from these checks. And here there are many possibilities, and it's easy to make a mistake. It happened so many times to many players, me including, when you have winning position and you think this is winning, this is winning. You can of course play knight g4, knight d5, bishop d6, maybe some other moves like rook e7. But you usually try to choose the most simple move without too many complications, and this is to take the pawn. And now white already not only has a very, very strong attack, but even has extra pawn, and he wants to take this knight and to play knight d5 check. So knight g6 was played. And here I have to decide between knight d5 and this knight to d5 and knight g4. There are many, many checks. But, okay, now if you want to checkmate the king, let's say if you move this knight to d5, the only move is king to g5, and now the king wants to escape to h6 or to h5. For example, now I don't see too many checks for white. If you play f4, king h5, the game now could be prolonged unnecessary, and not only this, but if he managed to exchange the bishops and to protect the king, he can bring the other rook to f8 or to e8, and then already you start a new game, basically. So you don't want to do this. That's why the knight has to go to g4. What is the difference? The difference is that he has to go to g5. I think this is the only move. And then you can use the fifth rank, surprisingly, with this rook. Rook c5 check was played. And this was actually the final move of the game. Here black has resigned because now bishop f5, you have knight e4 check. It's not helping too much. And if he moves the king to h4, there will be bishop to g3 check. And then it will be rook h5, knight h4, rook h4, checkmate. So I'm, by the way, very proud of this game because later when I was analyzing from the opening, it is not easy to see what went wrong for black. He has played the most natural moves, queen e7, d6, bishop b7, bishop g2, and somehow very forced white got a very big advantage in this endgame and very powerful attack. So I think, especially at this time when it was played in 95, it was also important theoretical game. So I hope that you have enjoyed this game, and see you next time.